The drill entered my skull behind the left ear at 0600 hours, and I remained conscious for the entire procedure because consciousness was required for calibration. The pain was irrelevant. They had told me this 14 times during the preparatory briefings, using the exact same phrasing each time, as if repetition could transform agony into abstraction. But pain, I discovered, is the one human experience that refuses abstraction, that insists on its own terrible specificity. The Medicae surgeon's hands were steady as he guided the auger bit through bone that had once been mine, into tissue that had once generated something called thought, and I could hear the wet grinding sound of the penetration, could taste copper and promethium on my tongue, could smell my own cauterized flesh mixing with the antiseptic incense they burned to sanctify the operation. They didn't kill me. They made me useful. My name was Harren Volk, and I had been a junior logistics coordinator in the administratum, assigned to Hive Primus on a world whose designation I am no longer permitted to remember. I was 37 years old, had served for 19 years without significant disciplinary action, maintained an efficiency rating of 87.3%, and had never once questioned an order or filing procedure. I was, by every measurable standard, unremarkable, precisely the kind of invisible functionary upon whom the entire machinery of governance depended. I processed requisition forms for military supplies, cross-referenced inventory manifests with delivery confirmations, flagged discrepancies for senior review. My life was a sequence of data entries and signature verifications, of forms stamped and files archived, and I had been content with this existence because contentment was the closest thing to happiness that anyone in my position could reasonably expect. The error occurred on a Tuesday during the third shift when fatigue had reduced my attention to a mechanical minimum, a requisition form for artillery shells, standard 155 mm, high explosive rounds, quantity 5,000, crossed my desk for final verification. The form appeared correct, proper authorization codes, appropriate departmental seals, delivery coordinates within accepted parameters. I stamped it approved and forwarded it through the processing chain without conducting the secondary verification check that regulations technically required, but that no one actually performed because performing it would have reduced our processing speed below acceptable thresholds. The shells were delivered to the coordinates specified, were loaded into artillery pieces, were fired during a military engagement 3 days later. 17 shells detonated prematurely in their barrels, killing 43 soldiers and wounding another 67. The remaining shells were duds, failing to explode upon impact, rendering an entire artillery battery useless during a critical offensive. The engagement was lost. 2,000 additional soldiers died in the subsequent retreat. The sector commander filed a formal complaint. An investigation was initiated. They traced the error back through the chain of custody, following the documentation trail like a predator tracking blood through snow. The shells had been manufactured incorrectly, sabotage possibly, or simple negligence at the foundry level, but multiple checkpoints had failed to identify the defect. Quality control at the manufactory, transportation security, receiving inspection, and finally, my desk, the last opportunity to prevent defective ordnance from reaching the front lines, the final checkpoint where a properly conducted verification would have flagged the irregularities in the weight specifications that indicated the shell's internal mechanisms were compromised. I was arrested at my desk, mid-shift, by enforcement officers who placed neural dampeners on my wrists and escorted me to a detention facility in the underhive. I was not informed of charges. Such information was deemed unnecessary for someone of my clearance level, but I understood implicitly that my life as I had known it was terminated. In the Empire, Errors of this magnitude did not result in reprimands or demotions. They resulted in recategorization from person to resource, from employee to material. The trial, such as it was, lasted 11 minutes. A tribunal of 3 adjudicators reviewed the documentation, confirmed the chain of causation, and rendered judgment. I was found guilty of negligence resulting in military losses, a crime whose severity was calculated not by intent but by consequence. 2,000 deaths. The mathematics were simple and absolute. I was sentenced to reclamation, my body and mind to be repurposed in service to the state, my identity to be subsumed into utility. I had seen reclamation before, had processed the paperwork for it countless times. Criminals, debtors, incompetents, the diseased and the deviant, all were subject to reclamation when their value as citizens became negative. Most were rendered down into servitors, their brains scooped out and replaced with cogitator systems, their bodies augmented with mechanical components and set to repetitive labor until mechanical failure or system decay finally released them. It was efficient, it was necessary, it was the only logical response to a universe that demanded maximum utility from minimum resources. But my case was different, the lead adjudicator informed me. My error had been cognitive, not physical. My brain had failed to perform the verification it was trained and required to perform. Therefore, my brain was the component that required correction, not replacement. I was to be remanded to the cerebral recalibration facility, where my neural architecture would be adjusted to prevent similar failures in the future. I would remain conscious, remain myself in some technical sense, but I would be improved, made useful, made incapable of error. The facility occupied 7 sublevels beneath the administratum tower, a labyrinth of surgical theaters and neural conditioning chambers that processed approximately 200 subjects per day. I was stripped, shaved, catalogued, and assigned a reference number that replaced my name in all official documentation. Harren Volk ceased to exist. Subject 7749 Delta took his place. They conducted preliminary examinations, cognitive testing, neural mapping, psychological profiling, and determined that my error had resulted from what they termed inadequate attention allocation during fatigue states. The solution was straightforward. My brain would be augmented with a monitoring system that would detect attention deficits and deliver corrective stimulus to maintain focus during critical tasks. The monitoring system required 3 components. First, a neural interface port drilled directly into the skull and anchored to the bone, through which external systems could access my nervous system. Second, a stimulus delivery mechanism, a grid of microneedles positioned against the surface of my brain capable of delivering precisely calibrated electrical impulses to specific regions. Third, an external processing unit that I would wear at all times, a metal box the size of a deck of cards that would be surgically attached to the base of my skull, monitoring my cognitive state and triggering corrections as needed. The surgery was scheduled for the following morning. I spent the night in a holding cell, unable to sleep, my mind cycling through variations of the same terrible realization. I was going to remain conscious while they opened my skull. I was going to be aware, thinking, feeling, while surgeons inserted machinery into the meat of my brain. I was going to experience, in real time and with full sensation, my transformation from person to tool. The drill entered my skull behind the left ear at 0600 hours. I have already said this, but the truth bears repetition, demands repetition, because that moment, the transition from intact to penetrated, from closed to opened, was the moment when I truly understood what they were doing to me. The pain was immense, but pain was only the surface experience. Beneath the pain was violation, the fundamental wrongness of having your interior exposed, your privacy of self breached by metal and intention. I could feel the drill's rotation, could sense the incremental advancement through layers of bone, could track its progress by the changing quality of sensation as it moved from the relatively insensate skull into the exquisitely sensitive meninges. The Medicae surgeon narrated the procedure as he worked, his voice clinical and dispassionate. Initial penetration complete. Anchoring neural interface port. Subject confirms sensory status. I feel it, I managed to whisper, my voice thin and weak. I feel everything. Confirmation noted. Sensation is expected and necessary for calibration. Beginning cortical probe insertion. The probe was worse than the drill. The probe moved through my brain like a worm burrowing through wet earth, and I could feel it displacing tissue, could sense the wrongness of foreign material inside my own mind. Worse, I could feel my thoughts changing as the probe advanced, not my conscious thoughts but something underneath them, the automatic processes that constituted my sense of self. It was like watching someone rearrange furniture in a room while I was still standing in it, like feeling my identity shift incrementally with each millimeter of the probe's advancement. Stimulus grid deployed. Conducting initial calibration. Subject, you will experience a series of targeted activations. Describe each sensation. The first pulse felt like anger, sudden and causeless, a surge of rage that filled my chest and tightened my jaw before evaporating just as quickly. The second pulse was fear, primal and overwhelming, the certainty of imminent death. The third was clarity, a sharpening of focus, so intense it felt like shedding a layer of gauze I hadn't known was there. Fourth, nausea. Fifth, euphoria. Sixth, something I had no name for, a sensation like my personality was being compressed, condensed, reduced to a more compact configuration. They continued this process for 3 hours, mapping the responses they could evoke, calibrating the intensity and duration of each stimulus. I described each sensation as ordered, my voice growing hoarse and mechanical, my responses becoming shorter and more precise as they fine-tuned the system. By the end, I could feel the external processing unit actively monitoring my state, could sense its attention like a pressure against the inside of my skull. It was alive in its way, not conscious, but attentive, a mechanical overseer watching my every thought and ready to correct any deviation from optimal performance. The surgeon sealed the incision, attached the external processing box, and administered a cocktail of drugs to prevent infection and reduce inflammation. Procedure complete. Subject 77749 Delta is approved for return to duty. Report to your assigned station in 72 hours for performance evaluation. I was escorted back to the holding cell, where I collapsed onto the narrow cot and tried to process what had been done to me. My head throbbed with a deep, bone-level ache that the painkillers barely touched. But worse than the physical pain was the constant presence of the monitoring system, that sense of being observed from the inside. I tried to think private thoughts, tried to imagine places or people or memories that belonged only to me, but every thought was accompanied by the awareness that something else was measuring it, evaluating it, judging whether it constituted appropriate cognitive activity. I touched the processing unit at the base of my skull, felt the warm metal and the taut seams where it had been grafted to my skin. This was part of me now, would be part of me for however long I remained. Alive and functional, I was augmented, corrected, made useful. They returned me to my desk after the mandatory recovery period, placed me back in the same chair where I had made the error that had cost 2,000 lives. My station had been modified slightly, a new monitor, a direct neural interface cable that plugged into the port behind my ear, additional verification protocols that now appeared mandatory on my screen. But the essential work remained unchanged, reviewing requisition forms, verifying documentation, flagging discrepancies for senior review. I began processing the first form of my first shift back, reading through the fields with what I thought was appropriate attention. The processing unit detected something, some microsecond lapse in focus, some wavering of attention too subtle for me to consciously register, and delivered a correction pulse. The sensation was like being slapped awake, a sharp spike of alertness that forced my attention back to complete focus. The form came into absolute clarity, every detail sharp and significant. I noticed a minor discrepancy in one of the authorization codes, flagged it, moved to the next form. The correction pulses came frequently during those first days, dozens per shift, my brain apparently prone to constant minor deviations that required adjustment. Each pulse was unpleasant, not quite painful but fundamentally uncomfortable, like being startled or shocked, and I found myself trying to anticipate them, trying to maintain perfect focus through sheer conscious effort in order to avoid triggering the corrections. But perfect focus was impossible to sustain. The human mind wanders, attention drifts, thoughts intrude. Every drift, every intrusion, every momentary lapse resulted in another pulse, another forced correction, another reminder that my cognition was no longer entirely my own. After 2 weeks, the frequency of pulses began to decrease. I was adapting, learning to maintain the level of attention the system demanded, internalizing its standards as my own. My efficiency rating climbed from 87.3% to 94.1%, then to 97.8%. I caught discrepancies I would have missed before, identified patterns of error in other people's work, prevented 3 potential supply chain failures that would have resulted in equipment shortages at critical facilities. I was performing better than I ever had as an unaugmented functionary. I was useful, but I was also changing in ways that extended beyond mere performance metrics. I found that I could no longer read for pleasure. My attention would fracture after a few paragraphs, scattering across the page without absorbing meaning, and the resulting correction pulses made the experience of reading more punishing than enjoyable. I could no longer engage in casual conversation. The lack of clear objective or purpose in social exchange triggered constant corrections, my brain categorizing such activity as attention-wasting distraction. I could no longer remember what it felt like to let my mind wander, to daydream or imagine or simply exist without purpose. The processing unit was training me, conditioning my cognition through negative reinforcement, shaping my thoughts toward maximum utility and minimum deviation. I was becoming precisely what they had intended, a flawless component in the vast administrative machinery, incapable of error because incapable of the inattention that produces error. And the terrible revelation was that I was complicit in this transformation, was actively participating in my own optimization because the alternative, constant correction pulses, constant discomfort, was worse than simply surrendering to the system's demands. 3 months into my augmented service, I encountered another functionary in the communal washroom during a shift break. He was younger than me, perhaps 25, and I noticed immediately the processing unit attached to his skull, identical to my own. He met my eyes in the mirror, and I saw recognition there, the acknowledgement of shared condition. "How long?" he asked quietly. 3 months. "You?" 14 months. He turned, showing me the base of his skull. The skin around his unit was scarred and inflamed, raised in ridges of chronic irritation. "It gets worse. The pulses become more frequent over time, not less. The system's standards keep rising. What was acceptable focus 6 months ago is now considered inadequate. It's training you toward a level of performance that humans aren't designed to sustain." What happens when we can't meet the standards anymore? He smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. They recalibrate, increase the intensity of the pulses, add additional stimulus grids to other brain regions. Eventually, if you continue to underperform, they classify you as defective augmentation and move you to full servitor conversion. But most don't make it that far. Most just break. Psychological collapse, cognitive fragmentation. The mind can only sustain that level of forced focus for so long before something gives. He left before I could ask more questions, and I returned to my desk feeling the weight of his words pressing against my thoughts. The processing unit detected my anxiety, elevated heart rate, scattered attention, and delivered a correction pulse that forced me back into work-appropriate focus. The fear remained, but it was compressed, pushed down into a place where it couldn't interfere with function. I processed forms for the rest of the shift with perfect efficiency, my conscious mind screaming silently while my hands and eyes continued their appointed tasks. The months accumulated, 6, 9, 12. My efficiency rating stabilized at 99.2%, a level considered exceptional for augmented functionaries. I received a commendation from my sector supervisor, a brief note acknowledging my improved performance and my successful integration of corrective augmentation. The note said nothing about what I had lost, about the person I had been before the drill entered my skull, about the fact that my usefulness had been purchased at the cost of everything that had made me something other than a tool. I began to notice changes in other aspects of my cognition. My memory was becoming fragmented, experiences filing themselves into categories of relevant or irrelevant with automatic efficiency. I could recall every detail of every requisition form I had processed in the past year, quantities, authorization codes, delivery coordinates, but I struggled to remember my mother's face, could not quite reconstruct the sound of my sister's voice. The processing unit was optimizing my neural storage, allocating resources toward work-relevant information, and allowing personal memories to decay through disuse. I tried to resist this process, tried to deliberately recall personal memories during my off shifts, but the act of remembering without purpose triggered correction pulses. The system had classified personal reminiscence as non-essential cognitive activity, a waste of neural resources that could be better allocated toward processing efficiency. I was being hollowed out from the inside, my selfhood gradually replaced by function, my identity subsumed into the singular purpose of error-free administrative processing. 14 months into augmented service, I encountered the same functionary again. His condition had deteriorated visibly. He was thinner, his movements jerky and uncertain, his eyes carrying a glassy dissociation that I recognized as the 1,000-yard stare of someone pushed beyond their cognitive limits. His processing unit had visible scorch marks where the heat generated by constant operation had burned the surrounding tissue. "I'm scheduled for recalibration next week," he told me without preamble. "Full neural restructuring. They're going to add stimulus grids to my motor cortex and visual processing centers, not just correcting attention anymore. They're going to control my physical movements, force my eyes to track optimally, eliminate the inefficiencies in my manual data entry. Can you refuse?" He laughed, a sound like tearing fabric. "Refusal is classified as malfunction. Malfunction results in immediate servitor conversion. There's no path except forward, no option except accepting each escalation until there's nothing left of you that could refuse even if you wanted to." I watched him leave, his gait already showing the signs of motor control augmentation. Too precise, too mechanical, movements that followed optimal efficiency paths rather than natural human kinetics. He was becoming something other than human, some hybrid of flesh and control system, and I understood with absolute clarity that I was following the same trajectory. That night, lying on my bunk in the habitation block, I tried to formulate a plan for escape, but every thought in that direction triggered correction pulses of increasing intensity, the system detecting the unproductive cognitive activity and forcing me back toward work-appropriate mental states. I could not even imagine escape without being punished for it, could not conceive of resistance without the processing unit detecting and correcting the impulse. I was trapped inside my own mind, my cognition surveilled and controlled by machinery that had become inseparable from my sense of self. The second year of augmented service brought new duties. My consistently high performance had qualified me for advanced processing, high security requisitions, classified material transfers, information that carried significant consequences if mishandled. The work required even greater focus, even more sustained attention, and the processing unit's correction pulses became correspondingly more frequent and intense. I developed chronic headaches, the neural tissue around the stimulus grids becoming inflamed from constant electrical activation. I requested medical evaluation, was informed that inflammation was expected and acceptable, was given stronger painkillers and ordered to continue my duties. I began to see other augmented functionaries throughout the administrative complex, recognized them by the processing units attached to their skulls, by the particular quality of their focused attention. We were a class of improved workers, optimized employees, living examples of the Empire's commitment to efficiency through technological enhancement. We never spoke to each other. Conversation between shifts was classified as time theft, triggered immediate corrections, but I could see in their eyes the same hollow awareness that I felt in myself. We were useful, we were effective, we were everything except what we had been before. 23 months into augmented service, during a routine processing shift, I experienced my first cognitive failure. A requisition form appeared on my screen, standard military supplies, nothing unusual, but I found that I could not read it. The words were visible but meaningless, my visual processing failing to convert symbols into semantic content. I stared at the screen for perhaps 15 seconds, my brain locked in some kind of loop, unable to progress forward or redirect attention elsewhere. The processing unit detected the failure and delivered correction pulses of escalating intensity, trying to force my attention back into proper channels, but the correction pulses themselves were overwhelming my capacity to process. I was trapped in a feedback loop, malfunction triggering correction, triggering overload, triggering further malfunction. The last thing I remember clearly was triggering the emergency alert, signaling that I required immediate medical intervention. Then consciousness became fragmentary, surgical lights, hands holding me down, voices discussing neural degradation and stimulus grid failure, the drill entering my skull again for recalibration. When I woke, I was in a medical bay, my head wrapped in bandages, a more advanced processing unit attached to my skull, larger, heavier, carrying additional components that extended down the back of my neck. The Medicae explained the modifications with clinical efficiency. My original stimulus grids had been augmented with additional coverage, expanding the system's control from attention regulation to broader cognitive management. The new unit would now monitor and correct not just focus deficits, but also processing speed, decision-making patterns, and emotional responses. Any mental state classified as suboptimal would trigger immediate correction. I was being upgraded, improved, made more useful. I tried to protest, tried to explain that I couldn't sustain this level of control, that there would be nothing left of me if they continued. But the new system detected my distress, elevated stress hormones, accelerated heart rate, thought patterns classified as counterproductive, and delivered a correction pulse that forced me into calm acceptance. The fear remained, but it was distant now, observable but not actionable, a fact about my condition rather than an emotion that could motivate resistance. They returned me to duty after 48 hours. The new system was immediately apparent in its effects. My thoughts moved faster, cycling through processing steps with mechanical precision. I felt decisions being made before I was consciously aware of making them, my hands moving to approve or reject forms based on analyses that my conscious mind only registered after the fact. The processing unit was no longer just correcting errors. It was actively directing my cognition, optimizing the pathways of thought itself, transforming me from operator to operated. The worst part was that it worked. My efficiency rating climbed to 99.8%, approaching theoretical maximum. I processed forms at twice my previous speed with 0 errors. I became a model of what augmented employees could achieve, was held up as an example during orientations for new functionaries facing reclamation. They would bring groups to observe me working, would point out my perfect focus, my flawless accuracy, my absolute dedication to duty. See, they would say, this is what humans can become when properly optimized. This is the future of administrative service. I wanted to scream at them, to warn them that what they were seeing wasn't achievement but obliteration, that my perfect performance came at the cost of everything that made performance meaningful. But the system detected these impulses and suppressed them before they could reach my motor cortex, before they could translate into speech or action. I had become a prisoner inside my own body, conscious but not in control, aware but unable to act on awareness. 3 years into augmented service, I stopped dreaming. Sleep had become purely functional, a biological necessity that the processing unit allowed only in measured doses optimized for cognitive recovery. Whatever neural activity produced dreams had been classified as inefficient, a waste of resources that could be better allocated toward processing optimization. My sleep was black and empty, a void between work shifts that contained no rest, no escape, no private space where I could be anything except what I had become. I encountered the other functionary one final time. He was being escorted by medical personnel, his movements completely mechanical, his eyes empty of recognition. The processing unit on his skull had been replaced by a full neural control assembly, the kind used for advanced servitors, and I realized that he had crossed the threshold I was approaching. He was no longer being corrected or guided. He was being operated, his body reduced to a remote-controlled tool, his consciousness either destroyed or buried so deep beneath layers of control systems that it no longer constituted a meaningful presence. I wondered how long until my own progression reached that point, how many more recalibrations my brain could sustain before the distinction between augmented human and servitor became meaningless. The processing unit detected my speculation, classified it as unproductive anxiety, and delivered a correction that forced me back into focus on my current task. The question died before it could fully form, replaced by the familiar clarity of purpose that defined my augmented existence. The years continue to accumulate, though I have lost track of their exact number. Time has become measured not in days or months, but in shifts worked, forms processed, corrections delivered. My efficiency rating has stabilized at 99.9%, the theoretical maximum for organic-based processing. I am the most useful I have ever been, the most effective employee in my entire sector. I am incapable of error, incapable of distraction, incapable of anything except flawless execution of my assigned function. Sometimes, in the microseconds between correction pulses, I catch fragments of who I used to be, a memory of sunlight through a window, the echo of a name that might have been mine, the ghost of an emotion I can no longer identify. But these fragments are immediately suppressed, classified as cognitive noise, eliminated before they can interfere with processing efficiency. I am not permitted to remember who I was, because who I was is irrelevant to what I have become. They didn't kill me, they made me useful. And I have come to understand that this was always the more terrible option, that death would have been mercy compared to this sustained obliteration of self in service of function. But understanding changes nothing. The processing unit detects my understanding, classifies it as acceptable reflection on past events, and allows it to exist for precisely as long as it takes to file the thought into memory before directing my attention back to the form currently displayed on my screen. I am subject 7749 Delta. I process requisition forms with perfect accuracy at optimal speed. I serve the Empire with flawless efficiency. I am exactly what they made me. And in the spaces between corrections, in the vanishing moments before thought is directed and controlled, I know that this is what happens when mercy is classified as resource waste, when human beings are treated as malfunctioning machinery requiring adjustment rather than destruction. They didn't kill me, they should have, but utility was deemed more valuable than mercy, and so I continue, year after year, processing forms with perfect efficiency, while whatever remains of Harren Volk screams in a place the processing unit cannot quite suppress, cannot quite eliminate, cannot quite transform into the optimal cognitive state that my augmented existence demands. I am useful, I am perfect, I am exactly what the Empire needs, and I remember in fragments the system cannot fully erase what it felt like to be something more than that.